I grabbed my phone, opened the Uber app, and accepted the next ride request without hesitation. Late night shifts were the quietest, and tonight promised smooth roads. The pickup was in a dimly lit parking lot of a closed, down shopping center on the outskirts of town. A place I'd driven past countless times but never stopped. As I pulled into the spot, the car's headlights barely pierced the darkness. I saw her standing by her car, a woman her late 30s, clutching a worn-out leather bag. Her eyes met mine, and there was an unsettling stillness in her expression. "Good evening," I greeted, trying to mask my unease. She nodded silently, sliding into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic. I started the engine, and she glanced around the car, her fingers tapping nervously on the seat. "Where to?" I asked, focusing on the road. She gave an address I didn't recognize, nestled between old industrial buildings. As I navigated the route, my phone buzzed with messages and notifications, all from unknown numbers. I glanced at the screen briefly but decided to focus on the road. The streets were eerily empty, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional distant siren. Her silence was unsettling. I tried to make conversation. "Long night." "She's been quiet all along, just staring straight ahead." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The GPS rerouted us unexpectedly on a narrow, winding road I hadn't driven before. Behind us, the town seemed to disappear, swallowed by thick trees and shadows. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice betraying my concern. She didn't answer, just continued to watch the scenery outside. My heart raced as the road grew narrower, the trees pressing in on either side. I checked the address again, confirming we were on the right path. Minutes felt like hours until finally, we reached a dilapidated house at the end of the road. Its windows were dark, and the porch light flickered sporadically. I turned off the engine and she handed me a key. "This is mine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Before I could respond, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, antique-looking mirror. "For protection," she said, pressing it into my hand. Her fingers were cold, sending a chill down my spine. I opened the door, and she stepped out into the night without another word, fading into the darkness. I sat there for a moment, the mirror heavy in my hand, then decided to leave. As I drove away, something felt off. I glanced at the mirror. Only my reflection stared back. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I continued driving back to town. But the roads seemed unfamiliar, twists and turns I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed again, the messages piling up, each one more cryptic than the last. "What did you take her ride?" She was never meant to leave. The mirror saw everything. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. The GPS malfunctioned, the screen flickering between locations. I tried to stay calm, but shadows seemed to dance just beyond my headlights. And every flicker of the mirror made me jump. I pulled over, heart pounding, and looked into the mirror again. This time, instead of my reflection, I saw fleeting images of the past passengers I'd driven, each one with a story untold, eyes filled with silent pleas. Were they warnings or something worse? Desperate, I grabbed the mirror and threw it out the window, hoping to break the cycle. The glass shattered, and for a moment, everything went silent. I felt a weight lift, but the relief was short-lived. The car began to flicker between reality and a distorted version of the roads I'd driven, looping endlessly. I realized too late that accepting that ride had bound me to this endless night, driving through memories and fears. The darkness outside mirrored the confusion within, and the mirror, my only connection to the passengers, was now just a broken reflection of my own terror. As the hours melded into an eternal dusk, I understood that some rides never end. They trap you in their shadow, leaving you to navigate the unknown alone, haunted by the echoes of every silent passenger who ever stepped into my car. Now, I wait in the dead of night, hoping for a way out, but the roads keep winding, and the darkness keeps swallowing me whole. Maybe one day someone will take my ride, and the cycle will continue. Until then, I'm lost between the reflections, driving endlessly into the abyss of my own fears. The night air was cool as I started my shift, the city lights flickering against the darkness outside my window. My phone buzzed with the first ride request, a usual pick, up from a downtown hotel. I navigated through familiar streets, the hum of the engine a comforting backdrop to my thoughts. The passenger arrived promptly, a middle-aged man with an unreadable expression. He didn't greet me, just slid into the back seat and handed me a small, worn-out map instead of entering an address. Puzzled, I glanced at it. Marked with several locations I didn't recognize, all clustered around the outskirts of the city. "Just follow the marks," he said, his voice low and steady. "No more explanation, no questions." I nodded, feeling a strange unease but trying to stay professional. As we drove, the cityscape gave way to unfamiliar roads and shadowed areas. My mind raced. Why would someone give me a map instead of an address? We reached the first marked spot, an old, abandoned warehouse. He asked me to wait while he went inside. Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the silent car, the darkness pressing in around me. When he returned, his face was even more inscrutable. "Next," he instructed, pointing to another location. We repeated this pattern several times, each stop more isolated than the last. Each time he remained silent, his presence growing more unsettling with every mile. I started to feel watched, the weight of his gaze heavy on my back. My phone's notifications continued to ping. More ride requests, more passengers. But something was off. The same man appeared again and again, always with the map, always leading me to these forgotten places. One night I decided to check the ride history. To my horror, every time I dropped him off, that particular ride was erased from my records. No trace of payment, no timestamp, nothing. I tried rebooting my phone, contacting Uber support, but there was no explanation. It was as if those rides never happened. Determined to uncover the truth, I started documenting each ride independently, taking photos of the map and noting the locations. As weeks turned into months, a chilling pattern emerged. Each drop-off site corresponded to unsolved missing person cases. Names, dates vanished without a trace, all linked to the routes he had me drive. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't just giving rides, I was part of something sinister, a shadow network facilitating disappearances under the guise of ordinary trips. The man never left after the last stop, but his presence lingered, a ghostly reminder of those lost. One night, as I awaited my next request, my phone remained silent. No rides, no signals, just an eerie stillness. I looked around, heart pounding. When the streets outside seemed to stretch impossibly, the landmarks distorted. The map in my hand glowed faintly, the marks shifting into new, unknown patterns. I tried to call for help, but my phone offered no signal. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped in this endless loop, driving routes that led to nowhere but deeper into darkness. The man's face appeared in the rearview mirror, his eyes hollow, reflecting my fear. As the city continued to sleep, I knew I was forever entwined in this horrifying cycle, a driver lost in the shadows of the night, haunted by the lives I unknowingly helped disappear. I never imagined that driving for Uber would lead me into darkest corners of my mind. It was a chilly October night. The streets of the city cloaked in shadows and the hum of distant traffic. My phone buzzed with a new ride request just as I was about to call it a night. The fare was decent, and the pickup was near my apartment, so I accepted without hesitation. The passenger's name was Mr. Thompson. The address was an old part of town, where the buildings leaned close together, their facades worn and stories untold. I arrived to find a sleek black sedan waiting under a flickering street lamp. There was no sign of movement inside, but the streets were silent, unsettlingly so. I opened the door, and a man stepped out. He was impeccably dressed, his demeanor calm, but something in his eyes unsettled me. We exchanged the usual greetings, and he gave me a precise address on Willow Street. As I started driving, the city lights blurred past, and an uneasy silence settled between us. I tried to make small talk, but he responded with short, clipped answers. Halfway through the journey, he handed me a small antique key. "For a token of appreciation," he said, his voice steady. I took it, noting the intricate design, something I couldn't quite place. My curiosity piqued, I asked about it, but he merely smiled and turned his attention back to the road. As we drove deeper into the city, the scenery changed. The buildings were older, the streets narrower, and an oppressive feeling hung in the air. My phone battery was running low, the screen dimming despite my efforts to charge it. I glanced at him, realizing how little I knew about this passenger. Suddenly, his voice broke the silence. "Have you ever felt like you're being watched?" I felt a chill ripple through me, not just by people, but by something else. I tried to laugh it off, but his eyes bore into mine, intense and unyielding. My heart raced as I sensed the weight of his gaze, the air thick with unspoken fears. The road ahead twisted through an area I wasn't familiar with, the headlights barely piercing the darkness. My mind started to race, wondering if I should pull over. But the meter kept running, the ride stretching longer than it should. I noticed that every street I passed seemed eerily deserted, the usual nightlife absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I tried to focus on the road, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as shadows seemed to creep along the edges of my vision. The key in my pocket felt heavier, its presence unsettling. I glanced at him again, desperate for a distraction, but he was silent, staring straight ahead. Minutes felt like hours until finally, we approached the destination. It was a small old house at the end of Willow Street, its windows dark and uninviting. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for the ride," he said, handing me the key again. "Keep it safe." I reached out to take it, but his grip was firm, almost forceful. My mind screamed that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite grasp. Before I could pull away, he released the key and stepped back into his car. I sat there frozen as he drove away into the night, leaving me alone with the flickering street lamp and a sense of dread settling over me. I sped back to my apartment, the city now seeming more hostile than ever. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the silence of the ride home. Once inside, I locked the door and sat in the dark, the key lying on the passenger seat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that the night had followed me home. Days passed, and the key remained on my mind. I researched its design, tracing its origins to a forgotten part of the city, a place rumored to hold secrets better left buried. The more I learned, the more uneasy I became, connecting the dots between Mr. Thompson's eerie questions and the key's dark history. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I drove to the address on Willow Street, the key burning a hole in my pocket. The house looked abandoned, but a single light was on inside. Heart pounding, I inserted the key into the lock, the door creaking open to reveal a dimly lit hallway. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air was thick with silence. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The room was empty, save for a mirror on the far wall. I approached it, and my reflection stared back, but something was off. My eyes felt hollow, my mind racing with the fears Mr. Thompson had spoken of. Suddenly, the reflection smiled, a sinister twist of lips that wasn't mine. I turned to run, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the room seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against my senses. The mirror's smile widened, and I realized that some keys open doors better left closed. I screamed into the void, trapped by my own curiosity and the shadows that now defined my reality. And so, I became a part of the night's mystery, another story whispered among the streets, a driver whose final ride was one he couldn't escape. To this day, I hear echoes of my own voice, reminding anyone who drives alone that some fares take you far beyond the road.